From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
To this day, historians are still attempting to explain just what led to one of the most horrific events in American history. Over 300 years ago, in the small New England town of Salem, Massachusetts, what started with the accusations of two young girls ended in widespread paranoia and injustice. Ultimately, more than 200 people would be accused of witchcraft, and at least 20 were executed. Were the accusers legitimately suffering from some sort of unknown medical malady? Or were they simply children who were lashing out against the extraordinarily strict Puritan way of life? Regardless, things quickly got out of hand as neighbor accused neighbor, husband accused wife, and so on. This week's guest is author Roz Shanzer, whose book Witches, the Absolutely True Tale of Disaster in Salem, is the basis for our conversation. Welcome to this week's mystery, the Salem Witch Trials on From the Void. All right, welcome to the podcast. I'm very excited this week to have a special guest on, Rosalyn Schanzer, who wrote a very cool book that I picked up. We were just talking about this a year ago in the Salem Witch Trial Museum, called Witches, the Absolutely True Tale of Disaster in Salem. Very cool book, very informative. So I appreciate you coming on today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So Salem is a really interesting kind of historical piece of American history. It obviously it's not unique to American history, even world history for that matter. We've seen sort of like, quote, witch hunts and things kind of get out of control in a similar way. You know, we're talking about like McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and there are a lot of instances throughout history. So this is a very fascinating kind of sociological instance in history. So what led you to be interested in this in particular and write all about it?
Well, the funny thing is that my editor at National Geographic suggested that I write a book about witches and about the Salem witchcraft trials. And I almost said no, because the last book that I wrote before this one, I have written whole bunches of books. There's 16 that I've written and illustrated, and the one right before this was banned. And the reason it was banned was that it was about, well, I'll tell you exactly. It was what Darwin saw, the journey that changed the world. And of course, if you write about Darwin, it's going to have some material in it that Texas doesn't want. So that was scary to me, and I thought that I would not be able to do the book easily. But when I started reading about Salem, it was so very interesting, and the trials were so very interesting, and the story is so scary that I couldn't help it. And I'm really glad that I wrote the book. It was amazing to do the research and to find out what happened in such a strange situation. You know, I think that it's important to notice that the book about Salem is written and illustrated by me. And so the art was very important to the book. And I think you kind of can tell more about the story by the way the art is written than just reading the words. I think it makes the story come alive. I don't know how you felt about it, but that was a fun thing for me. So,
yeah, I thought that was very cool. I thought the illustrations were very lent a lot to it, and I didn't realize that you were the person who did the illustrations. So I thought that was exceptionally cool.
Yeah, and I have to brag about it a little. You can maybe forget about the bragging part, but it won the best illustrated book of the year from the Society of Illustrators in New York City, which is a really big deal. And the book won the best writing of the year it's a Cybert Award for nonfiction. So that made me feel good too. But I really think that without the artwork, it doesn't shine as much. And so I can talk about that part, and I can talk about witches, and I can talk about all of the above.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we were starting to do too, it was talk a little bit about kind of set the stage for people in terms of what type of village Salem was at the time, what type of people. We were talking a little bit about the Puritans who lived there, because there are a lot of things that, as you kind of dive deeper into this story, this historical event, there are a lot of things that kind of go into the stew that created this horrible tragedy, essentially. But there are a lot of things that kind of lent to it that combined into this combustible situation. So talk a little bit about, like, we're talking the 1600s. This is before we're officially a nation. And we've got these Puritans escaping Europe for a simpler way of life. But they, for those out there listening who know anything about puritanical, the views of the Bible and kind of their way of living, it's very, very strict. This was not like a fun place for kids to grow up, I would imagine.
It wasn't, and we didn't, if you lived there today, you would not like the version of God, because God was just a real tough guy. And every time anything in the atmosphere went wrong, like if there was a tornado, or if there were strange lights in the sky, or if people were killed in certain accidents, they all thought that it was the work of God, because God was angry with them. And this was a very angry God. And all the ministers, the minister in Salem at that time thought so too. So in January in 1862, it was a very, very freezing cold day. This is, by the way, the people who came to America as the Puritans at that time, they were trying to escape from the European way of doing religion, which was full of pomp and circumstance and fancy stained glass windows, and the popes were often crooked. And so these people came to America because they wanted a much simpler life without all that pomp and circumstance, and just based on basically being good. Even though they were terrified of God, they wanted just to be good people. And so that's why they came in 1624. But by January of 1692, it's a freezing cold day in Salem town. And the minister of Salem town, the parson, is named Samuel Parris. And he's the Puritan minister. And he is a furious guy, absolutely furious, because it's freezing cold in his house. The people who run the town are supposed to be paying him money so that he'll have logs and things that will make it warm in the house, and they're not supplying them at all. And he is owed all his money that he's supposed to be paid for being a minister. And he's really, really angry. And he's sitting down writing and doing all his sermons about how people should stand up to God and be paid. And all of a sudden, his 9-year-old daughter, whose name is Betty, and his 11-year-old niece named Abigail start in this cold place. They start twitching and choking and contorting their bodies into strange shapes and crouching under the furniture and speaking in words that make absolutely no sense. And so the family is terrified. They don't know why this is happening to these kids. Now, there's been instances of such things throughout the history of the time that the Puritans first started moving to the country, but it had never affected them before, and they had no idea why it was happening now. And so they try everything by praying, and they try to make it warmer in there, and they try to see what's happening, and they cannot possibly figure it out. So they have two slaves, and their names are Tituba and John Indian. And in those days, people did have slaves, and they had a couple of them. And the slave Tituba actually was stolen from South America when she was a little girl and brought to America. And John Indian became her husband, and he was an Indian. That's why he was named John Indian. And they loved the kids. So one of the days that they couldn't figure out anything, the parents went to a doctor. And remember about the slaves and put that aside for a second. So the parents go to a doctor, and the doctor comes and he examines the children, and he says that they have been taken over by witches, and that they are in trouble because the witches have invaded their bodies, and it's all about witches. So the parents are really upset, and they go out of town one day to a meeting. And while they're gone, a person who lives near them has told Tituba and John Indian of a way to get rid of witches that are in the people who are afflicted by such horrible things. And so that woman taught them to do was to take the urine of the children and mix it with some flour and make it into a magic witch cake, which they did. They made a round thing. It looked just like a witch cake. And then what they were supposed to do was feed that to a dog, and it was going to work. So they feed this witch cake to this poor dog. And as they're doing that, trying to save the children, who should come back home but the Reverend and his wife. And they are absolutely infuriated. They think this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. So everything starts to get worse from there. And that's the beginning that sets off the story, which we can proceed about. So
yeah, so it kind of, there's a lot of things happening that kind of, as you say, set the stage. So ironically, the kind of match that lights the flame occurs in a minister's house, and it's based on his daughter and the niece. And you've also got the slave who, slaves in those days are looked at as less than human. And she tries to, do the ceremony, make this witch cake that clearly not based out of Christianity. So obviously they're already, up in arms about that. And then the other thing that you mentioned that kind of lends to this as well, as you talk about in the book, is, witchcraft isn't necessarily something that's new here. They had actually cases of witchcraft or claims of witchcraft long before 1692, but most of these cases are thrown out of court. But it's kind of already in the zeitgeist. And furthermore, you've got some ministers that, I'm sure we'll talk about later, Increase in Cotton Mather, who had been writing books and essays about it in the late 1680s. So it's kind of putting these ideas out there, which kind of comes back to the doctor who immediately his head goes to, it's not a physical affliction. This clearly is the work of witchcraft.
They definitely think it's witchcraft, and a lot of people start believing in it and panicking. And so it's all going to go to court. And first, the people who are running the courts are either dishonest a lot of times, or they just don't know, or they have special interests. And so if you go to Salem, you can even read all the recordings of everything that went on in court. So I was able to do that. And there's pages and pages that show every single page of what happened during the trials. And people were coming from miles around, and they were afraid of the witches. And terrified that they might become witches, and they started seeing things. They started thinking or saying that they saw apparitions in the air, that people were turning them into witches, and all terrible things were happening. And the crowds came from miles around to hear the court trials. And what would happen was every time more and more and more people would be accused, they'd all be sent to prison, whether they were innocent, which of course they all were, but nobody believed that, or whether they were innocent or not. They were sent to these horrible jailhouses, and the jailhouses were absolutely flooded with prisoners, none of whom were really witches. And so if you were in jail, it stunk. Everybody was like chained up. You had to pay for your own food, and you had to pay, quote, jail expenses. And meanwhile, you had to pay jail expenses while people were taking over your houses, while you weren't there, while your children weren't there, and they were living alone. And so it was just a horrible, horrible situation, which gets worse.
Yeah, so talk about because initially it starts out with just a few people being accused, and then obviously it exponentially grows from there. So talk about the 3 initial people accused of witchcraft, and you kind of touched a little bit already on the state of the jails and that sort of thing, but talk about the 3 initial accused women, and then also I think what's interesting and important about that is also to talk about the kind of the legal process, like how they initially, determined if this person was a witch or not, physical examinations and so forth.
So Paris decides Tituba is a witch, and he scares his kids into saying who are witches, and they said Tituba and John Indian were witches. So Paris says to Tituba, "Oh, you have to go to jail for this, but I'm going to get you out if you admit that you're a witch. But you have to admit that you're a witch, and you have to tell a story about how you're a witch, and then I'll just get you out of jail." So Tituba doesn't know what to do, but she believes her master, and she's sent to jail, and they interview her in court, and she said, "Yes, I'm a witch," and she tells all this magnificent tale about how she became a witch, and you can read in the book what all these people make up, and she really believes that, that Paris is going to get her out of jail for doing this. But does he? No, absolutely not. He leaves her in jail. And in fact, she's one of the last people at the end who even gets out of jail. And the only way that she got out is if somebody bought her to be their own slave. And that's what happened. A person bought her. But the stories that were made up by the accusers that got all these people into jail, a lot of them, there were a lot of reasons for that. And some of the reasons for it are at the end of the book, which is sort of the most interesting place in a way. But the people who accused other people, a lot of them were teenagers. And they were kind of typical teenagers in a way. They'd go to court and they would pretend that they were being attacked by invisible witches that they would give names to. And nobody who was watching the court proceedings could see these invisible witches, but the girls who were teenagers and so forth, they would start to twitch and wriggle all around on the floor and scream and pinch themselves and say the witches were pinching them, and they were acting like they were terrified, and they were very creative in their attempts to accuse all these different people that maybe they didn't like, or maybe they were making fun of, or maybe their parents told them to attack because some of the people they owed money to, they didn't want to pay the money to the people who they owed money to, or various other reasons. Anyway, everybody started believing that these creative girls who were twitching and screaming were telling the truth. And so many people were accused that were perfectly good people that it was just horrendous. And we can talk about who some of those were too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating though that essentially the thing that gets this whole thing started is basically off the word of teenagers or children essentially, and the role of what they called spectral evidence, which I thought was a fascinating component of all of this, which is essentially invisible evidence as opposed to physical evidence, and that comes into play much later. But obviously, initially, it's just the word of these children essentially that kicks this whole thing off.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting people that they put into jail was called the King of Hell, and he was a minister that had lived once upon a time. He was a minister in that town, and he didn't get paid, so he moved. But there were accusations against him from the people who refused to pay him, and they wanted to get him in trouble. So he lived in an entirely different town in Maine, and he was brought to Salem because he was accused by the people in Salem of being a witch and being the devil, actually, and accusing all these people and turning all these people into witches himself. And so one of the girls told terrible stories about him, all lies, and told how he got a huge number of women to turn into witches, of course, which they weren't. And he had them drinking blood and doing all kinds of terrible things. And so this guy was actually one of the main people who died, and he was popular where he lived. He was a real nice guy. He was real strong, and helped the people in the town to do lots of things, and everybody loved him up there. But he got dragged to Salem, so that wasn't very nice. I wish you could see the pictures. There's the illustrations are on scratchboard, and they're not exactly realistic. They're more symbolic than realistic. And so scratchboard, if you don't know what that is, it's a thin hard board, and on top of the hard board is a layer of white, very finely, very fine clay, a layer of very white material. And over the top of that is black India ink. So to make the pictures, you have to use a sharp tool that's very, very pointy and small, and scratch through the black part and make the picture appear in white. And so all of these pictures that are in there are done with the scratchboard illustration. I think it would really be fun if people could see that part. And I'm not sure how we can make that happen, but
I'll definitely post some on social media when we release the episode. They're very cool, and some of them are extremely detailed. So I can't imagine how long it took you to. The Atlantic Ocean picture in particular is one that comes to mind with the 3 ships in the ocean. Very cool. It complements the story very well.
Yeah, that ship in the ocean, by the way, it's if you look in the water, you can see that underneath the water, underneath the boat, coming along with them is a kind of the scary form of the devil, because they brought the idea of the devil along with them. And so that's one of the kind of symbolic pictures that I put on that one page. And
yeah, I'll definitely post some of these so folks can see, but definitely also go out and get the book for sure, because there's a lot of illustrations in there that I think are really neat. So one of the other interesting things too that I would love for you to talk about is, along the way, there are moments or opportunities rather to stop this kind of ball from rolling, or this sort of avalanche effect that occurs. You've even got, at one point, one of the accused, John Proctor, his servant, Mary Warren, who initially is one of the accusers actually admits to lying and says, "Hey, look, these girls, they've been faking these fits." And instead of saying, "Okay, we need to take a deeper look at this, perhaps where we've got innocent people on our hands," they just kind of she then gets accused of being a witch, and then things really start to kind of get out of hand at that point. So talk a little bit about that, and just, there are other instances too throughout the story where there are opportunities to kind of take a deeper look and maybe even push pause on the situation and maybe say, hey, like there's some other motivations here at hand. Like you mentioned, potentially financial motivation, or, folks that just didn't like each other, or just in a lot of cases, some of these people who are accused are just, what would be considered kind of odd folks, like people with crooked backs, or like just weren't considered, quote, normal, are the folks who are being accused of being witches here.
Yeah, some of them are old men that are in bed, and old women who can't get out of bed, and people who are just kind people or poor people. But there are rich people who are involved too, and people might be mad at them because they were jealous of them, or they felt that they were owed money. And as the end neared, people started thinking a little bit harder about that, and especially when all those people were hanged. And none of them that were hanged, if you said you were actually a witch and you were in jail, you were likely to get out. But if you refused to say that, and some people figured that out and they were able to get out of jail, even though they had to pay their jail fees first. But if you were absolutely convinced that this was fake, if you weren't at all a witch, you would not say, I am a witch, because they knew that if they died and they went to, quote, heaven, and they said that they were a witch, they wouldn't get into heaven because you can't lie. And so if they didn't lie, they would get into heaven. If they said, I didn't do it, they were right. When they got to heaven, they'd get out. So they didn't confess. And then those people that didn't confess and that were likely targets for various reasons, they were the ones that got hanged. And everybody would come to see them get hanged. And they were hanged in horrible ways. And as I said, 19 of them ended up being hanged before people kind of got sick of this and started realizing that it was not kosher somehow. And so one of the guys was crushed. They made him lie down, and they poured big, huge rocks on his chest until he died. But the rest were hanged, and everybody came and cheered and loved that they were hanging. And until it got so old that people said, wait a minute. And I know that it's kind of in and out of order, but some of the judges were corrupt. Some of the people were making money off of the more wealthy people. So there was a couple that was a wealthy couple, and certain people in charge were making money by stealing everything in their houses, by taking over their lands and getting money in many other ways. And the corruption got worse and worse on behalf of all the accusers. And that was starting to affect people and starting to make people wonder what was up. And did the people who were the accusers get away with this? Sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. So if you read the book, and I think the last segment about what happened to everybody after the witch trials is one of the most interesting. And I would leave it to readers to check that out, because that's fun, and maybe they would like to see in the book what it has to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the gentlemen that you mentioned just a second ago, I believe you were referring to Giles Corey, who, from my understanding, the reason he was essentially pressed to death or crushed to death he was one of the folks who knew that if he spoke up and tried to defend himself during trial, it was better just to stay silent, because he knew that if he did confess, that all of his property and his inheritance would get taken away, and his family, his children, his descendants, in essence, wouldn't receive any of it. So he knew that if he stayed quiet, even if he was killed, they would at least inherit, his possessions.
Yeah, maybe, but the stuff of people got taken away anyway. And some of the people were reimbursed a teeny weeny little bit, and some people weren't reimbursed at all. And a lot of the families who did get out of jail had nothing left to speak of. And you couldn't even, as I mentioned before, you couldn't even get out of jail, even if it was over, until you paid all your jail fees. So if you were a poor person, you couldn't, or somebody in your family couldn't help you. You could not get out of jail. So that was a bad thing.
And a lot of people, I remember I went on the tour while I was there, and they talked a lot about the fact that the jails got to the point where they were overflowing, and as you mentioned, were horrible conditions to begin with.
Yeah.
On top of that, a lot of people were being tortured to elicit confessions, and a lot of folks didn't even make it to trial. Either died in jail or died as a result of torture.
Yeah, they did. And little children were in jail. So there was one little girl who was 4 years old who was accused of being a witch. She and her mother were the ones that had come knocking on the door, asking for food from Paris before all of this started. So this little, I think her name was Dorcas, and she's 4. And when they put her in jail, she's an innocent little kid, and they put her in chains for a real long period of time, like tied to a wall with chains. And when she got out, she just never was quite normal again after that. I mean, who would be after such a horrible thing?
Yeah, talk about the age before therapy, like holy cow. Yeah. There's the basic details in the public consciousness. Everyone, you say Salem, you immediately think witch, but not a lot of people know the details about what happened and kind of this cautionary tale behind it.
Well, all I can say is that people were so superstitious during that period that they believed anything. And so even before the witch trials began, when the people from Europe, mostly England, came to America, they were terrified even of the Indians, and they felt like the Indians were somehow witch-like. And the Indians weren't, but they thought that the Indians were shamans and all of that kind of things, and there were wars over that with the Indians. So that it was there in Europe, and it was there in America before all of this started. And then there were cases that can't be solved to this day, can't be fully figured out, that people did have that twitching and horrible contorting of their bodies. That was already going on. It just came to a head in Salem in particular, and with the humongous numbers instead of large numbers of people that it happened to. But throughout history, everybody that was European really did believe in witches. They really did. And witches would be tortured in Europe before the Puritans ever came to America. And they'd be hanged, and they'd be dunked in waters and drowned. And every time your cow died, or every time anybody got sick, a lot of people blamed all of that on witches in advance of Salem altogether.
Yeah, and what's interesting too is it goes all the way up to the highest reaches of government at the time too. Like, this was kind of a commonly held belief. You talk about in the book about Governor William Phipps, who, again, another opportunity to shut this thing down and say, this is probably nonsense. Let's not continue down this road, but instead he puts together this court of, I believe it's pronounced Oyer and Terminer,
Yeah.
which is the first official court, that's kind of constructed to oversee the witch trials, and he kind of fully endorses it, despite the fact that the people, these justices that he appoints, none of which are, as you mentioned in the book, like kind of qualified to do what they're doing. Like none of them have degrees in law or anything of that nature. It's just kind of this group of, for the most part, superstitious individuals, with the exception of kind of one guy, this Nathaniel. I'm trying to pronounce his name, Satanstall.
I don't know.
Yeah, he's kind of the only one who's like, I don't know if I buy this, and he at one point resigns, I think, and himself gets accused of being a witch, and you're like, of course.
Yeah, you better not resign because you'll get accused. And then afterwards, there were some people who tried to fix matters. They didn't necessarily come from Salem, and they wanted people who had been in jail to be reimbursed. And there were some people who absolutely disagreed. And there were some people that were just so plain greedy that, as I said before, they ruined the lives of the people who actually did get out of jail, because none of them had anything left. And some of the girls, there's a real interesting piece at the end where one of the girls who was the most vocal confesses to the new preacher, who happens to be honest, that she had lied, and he helped her write a letter that apologizing, because she was really good at making stuff up. You would think that she was going to have a book of her own where she made up everything in it, and everybody gave her every possible award for her wonderfulness, but she had been lying all along. She was just very inventive. Anyway, she said, I did it. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done it, and I am terribly sorry that I did. And my parents are already dead, and she died when she was pretty young herself after making that admission with the new preacher who was in town, who's actually an honest person.
Wow. Yeah. So talk about that a little bit. Like, well, actually, before we get to that point, I do want to comment on the fact that it's what I find really interesting that I wasn't aware of before is the role of the father and son, the Mathers, who kind of have a strange role in this whole thing, because they kind of, in one sense, feed into this fervor by, writing all these things about witchcraft and the devil. But then on another hand, they kind of come into the story again later on saying, well, I don't know if it's right that we're trying people solely based off of spectral evidence. We should probably look at physical evidence as well, and sort of come to the aid of some people. But then also, it's this very strange kind of connection they have to the whole thing.
Everybody has a strange connection, and they go back and forth about what they believe and what they don't believe. But I think in the bottom of their minds, in the back of their minds, the people who lied knew perfectly well what they were lying about. And so they had money issues, like they wanted somebody's money, or somebody didn't pay them, or somebody had to pay them, or that they didn't own what they thought they should own. They had all kinds of strange reasons. And that's why I keep saying the last chapter is one of the most interesting ones, because it tells how and why, and who was honest and who was not, and who lied. And the other amazing thing is how well the liars told their stories. So there's a link. Like if you go on, I think I sent it to you, or if you go on Amazon and look for the book, there's, or in my website, there's a link to a video that tells what one person made up and told. And it's illustrated by me. It's actually, I did the little movie one frame at a time to show what happened when somebody believed that witches had swooped down from the sky and killed everybody. I strongly suggest checking that one out.
Absolutely. I'll provide that link in the show notes, certainly. So yeah, so talk about like obviously at one point it's so out of control that there are just tons and tons of people sitting in these jail cells awaiting trial, and but eventually it starts to kind of unravel, and you start to see people kind of start to come to their senses and realize there's just no way that even if it were true that there were some legitimate witches here, certainly it can't be all of these people, and so you start to see it unravel, and eventually you start to see people getting released from jail and that sort of thing. So what was kind of the start to the unraveling of that whole thing?
Yeah, there's a chapter called "The End Is Here," and it tells how all of that happens. It gets cooler. It becomes autumn. The wind starts to blow in New England, and it becomes obvious that changes in the air, and people are just getting more and more scared about it and realizing that some of these people were actually being executed because of hearsay and malicious gossip and invisible evidence that nobody could really see except the girls who, for example, who were twitching around on the floor, but you couldn't see anything. So some people even wondered whether the accused people were witches themselves, and especially since they said they could talk so easily with the devil and become some, contorted and conditioned and everything themselves. And people just, far too many people that were upstanding people and Puritans from the best families were being packed off to jail because the main accusers seemed perfectly healthy outside of the jail room. So they'd be twitching around in there, and then they'd come outside and they'd be walking around talking to everybody and having a swell time. And they didn't have a bad time till they came back in the courtroom. So hello, something up,
A little acting, perhaps. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, you did mention earlier there is some component of this where there were some instances where people were convulsing and seemed to have physical issues. What are some of the theories behind that?
They don't exactly know, but it was really a thing. And the two girls that were the daughters that started the whole thing, one of them died young, and the other one eventually started getting better and stuff. So whatever was happening, it happened to not just people. It was something real because some of the cows died, a few animals died, and because it had been going on for such a long time. The fact that it came to a head in Salem was unique because whatever it was that these people were randomly being afflicted by was the same thing. They'd be twitching and they'd be contorting their bodies way before the witch trials, but after 1629, I guess around the 1630s, that's when a lot of that twitching business began. So just somehow it came to a head right at a bad time or a good time or whatever for witches.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard some theories that molds in the baked goods and things of that nature. Hard to say, but yeah, just interesting all around. There's not a lot of answers, it seems, and it's hard because we're talking about an incident that happened hundreds of years ago, and so in terms of any type of evidence or ability to determine if it was some sort of medical malady, it's almost nearly impossible to know for sure.
Right. They just flat didn't know. They didn't know about germs. They didn't know about doctors who could, treat you the way we do in the year 2022 even. And I think doctors have had trouble figuring out what's wrong with people forever, and it keeps evolving. So even in World War II, people hadn't figured out everything about how to make people better, much less in the Civil War when they'd lop off your arms and legs and not clean their equipment. Doctors still didn't know anything that much later, much less in the 1600s. And so it's a mystery to me. I don't
Yeah,
know
yeah.
if I can specifically solve it, but yeah, we're not quite sure why they did that, but there are lots of possibilities.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's as you said, we were still very early in the game in terms of what we understood from a medical perspective. There are many cases over the course of history where people got accused of being possessed by the devil when in fact it was things that we understand today to be mental illness or epilepsy or things of that nature. So a lot of that could probably be contributed to, things that we understand more now than we did, back then.
Absolutely. And of course, not just in the Americas, because witches were in deep trouble and were dunked underwater and drowned if you thought they were witches in Europe, too. So that moved across the ocean with the Puritans. It wasn't made out of whole cloth once they got here. The witches thing was old, ancient.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on. What any last thoughts about any sort of revelations that you discovered while doing the research here that you thought were kind of interesting?
I thought the whole thing was fascinating. I thought it was different from anything I had ever done. The other books that I've written and illustrated are mostly for a younger audience, children, ages all the way from like first grade through something like this, which can be attributed to adults. Even I think it's even interesting for adults, but it was a young adult book, and I I find it much easier to write something long like this book rather than something short. For example, my best-selling book of all times is George versus George, The American Revolution as Seen from Both Sides. And it's for like grades 4 and up to adult. And to write a shorter book, which is only 64 pages, is a lot harder to put into a small space with tons and tons of content that's going to grab you by the arm. And that book's still in print since 2004. It's sold about 500,000 copies, and it's a lot harder to write than Witches, where I can put in every single bit of the information and make it be 130 some odd pages, and with pictures in it. So just to set that record straight.
Yeah, I could definitely see how that, especially this particular story in history, there's so much detail involved in it. It would have been nearly impossible to write a short version of this.
And I was so happy to be able to do it. It really frees you up because you can put in all the coolest stuff in the whole wide world. And it's not that there's not tons of information in the other books that I wrote about history. There is. And the pictures really help because they tell a whole lot of the story and keep, people tuned in. But to be able to write the long version was wonderfully freeing for me. I really liked doing the longer version of the book. A lot of the books that I illustrated but did not write were for everything from little children to adults. And so I've done that too, but I didn't like the fact that I wasn't able to illustrate those books, even though it was fun to write the pictures. So this was a terrific thing. And like I said, I've written and illustrated, actually, it's 17 books for kids. The most recent one is not published, which is a whole nother conversation. It is Abe versus Jeff, the Civil War is seen from both sides. And I think it's my most important book, but it's too controversial, apparently, at the current time to tell both sides of a war about the Civil War and offer it to a younger audience.
As somebody who, my undergraduate degree is in history, that pains me.
Yeah.
I think there's a way to tell history in a way that's unbiased, and it is what it is. The facts are the facts. But
I agree with you 100%.
Well, I hope that comes out. But before I let you go, tell people where they can go to stay up on top of your work. And hopefully when that book comes out, where's the best place to get your books?
Well, I do have a website that used to be animated, and the animation part of it is no longer available because that capability was taken off the air. But it's Roz.Shanzer. Let's see. You can also, I'll tell you what's easier. Go to Amazon, look up Witches, The Absolutely True Tale of Disaster in Salem. My name is on it. And if you click on my name or any of those parts, you can also find all of the other books, and they're on Amazon too. And you'll see something very different from each one of those books and the styles of the artwork. It's pretty fun to see what else is done. And if you find my website, which I will send to you, you can see the commentary and some of the pictures for each book as well. I'll
Perfect.
send you the link. Okay.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll definitely make sure that the link is in the show notes. So please go support and pick up a copy of the book. It's outstanding. Like I said, I found it in the actual official Salem Witch Trials Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. And it's a great read. Tons of great history in there. And the illustrations just make it. So thank you so much for coming on and talking all about this.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was really fun to talk to you.
Absolutely.
Much appreciated.
Anytime. We'll have to have you back on when talk about one of the other topics that you've covered.
Excellent. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Were the Salem witch trials a result of misbehaved children kicking off a chain reaction of accusations? Were the initial accusers actually suffering from some sort of unknown medical issue? One theory is that perhaps the accusers really were afflicted via a fungus called ergot, found in rye, wheat, and other cereal grasses that are known to cause muscle spasms, vomiting, delusions, and hallucinations. Regardless, Salem was certainly an extremely devout Puritan society that firmly believed in the power of the devil's influence. That, combined with the constant fear of Native American attacks, harsh winters, and jealousy between the haves and the have-nots, certainly created the perfect storm for the hysteria that followed. And if we've learned anything from history, we know that what happened in Salem back in 1692 isn't unique to history. All we have to do is look to the internment camps during World War II, or the McCarthyism paranoia and the Red Scare of the 1950s. All it takes is fear plus a trigger to equal a scapegoat that creates the perfect storm for a witch hunt. No matter how advanced we feel we are as a society, witch hunts still exist today. Thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast episode. If you enjoy what we're doing, please subscribe, rate, and review, and also tell a friend. I'll be back next week with an all-new mystery, and until then, happy Halloween, and thanks for listening to From the Void.